All right, buckle up for a trip through time. We're diving deep into Sharon McMahon's book, The Small and Mighty, 12 Unsung Americans Who Changed the Course of History.
Ooh, that sounds interesting. I love the idea of uncovering those hidden figures, the ones who don't always make it into the history books.
Yeah, exactly. It's like we all know about the big names, right?
Yeah.
But history's made by so many people, and Sharon McMahon really brings those unsung heroes to life.
So are we gonna, debunk some myths? Or uncover some secrets? I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Uh-huh. Well, maybe. We're definitely going to learn about some fascinating people and their contributions. Are you ready to rethink what you thought you knew about American history?
Bring it on. Let's get started.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a founding father who might not be a household name, Gouverneur Morris. You know, when I think founding fathers, I kind of picture those serious dudes in powdered wigs. But Gouverneur Morris was, well, he was a bit of a rebel.
A rebel founding father. Now that's intriguing. How so?
Well, for starters, he had a peg leg.
Yeah.
And a disfigured arm. Oh, and he had a reputation as a ladies' man.
Whoa, okay. Definitely not your typical founding father. It just goes to show that they weren't just stuffy figures in history books. They were real people.
Totally. And, you know, beyond his, let's say, colorful personality, Morris played a huge role in shaping America. Mm-hmm. He actually wrote the preamble to the Constitution. Those iconic words, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union.
Wow, the preamble. It's so ingrained in our culture. I never really thought about who actually wrote it, though.
Me neither. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. He crafted those words that would define a brand new nation. And they've endured for centuries.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. To write something that would capture the essence of America, the ideals, the aspirations, it's a huge responsibility.
Absolutely. And you have to remember the context, too. The debates, the compromises, the whole struggle to create this new nation. It was a pretty chaotic time.
Totally. And it's interesting. The preamble isn't just a historical document. It's still relevant today.
I see what you mean. Like, those ideals of a more perfect union are still something we're striving for. Even now.
Exactly. It's a reminder that America is always evolving, always working towards something better. But, okay, enough about the serious stuff for a sec. You mentioned Morris was a bit of a character, right? What else can you tell me about him?
Well, there's this kind of funny story about him and his struggles with gout. Apparently, he tried to relieve the pain using, wait for it, a whalebone.
A whalebone? Seriously? Ouch.
Yeah, I know, right? It's kind of a crazy story. And believe it or not, it connects to the history of the Bronx.
Okay, now I'm really curious. How does a whalebone and gout lead us to the Bronx?
All right, so Morris's family owned a big chunk of land in what's now the Bronx. They bought it from a Dutch farmer named, you guessed it, Bronx.
The Bronx. I see where you're going with this.
Yep. And over time, the name morphed into the Bronx we know today.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, a whalebone-wielding founding father and a Dutch farmer played a role in shaping New York City.
History's full of these weird little connections, isn't it? So I got to ask, what do you think Gouverneur Morris would make of America today?
That's a great question. I mean, those ideals he wrote about in the preamble, how do they hold up in the 21st century? That's definitely something to think about.
Totally. It's like his words are still sparking debate and inspiring us to strive for something better, even after all these years.
All right, let's switch gears now. Ready for our next deep dive. Let's journey westward and hear the incredible story of Clara Brown. She went from enslavement to becoming a successful entrepreneur in Colorado. Talk about resilience.
From enslavement to entrepreneur. Wow, that's quite a journey. I'm ready to hear all about it.
It's a really powerful story. The book starts with this heart-wrenching scene where Clara is separated from her daughter. It's pretty intense.
Oh, wow. I can only imagine how difficult that must have been.
Yeah, it's tough to read. Basically, she hears her daughter screaming, "Mama!" and finds her pointing downstream where her younger sister was swept away by the current. Talk about a traumatic experience.
That's just heartbreaking. And to think this was during a time when, slavery was still a reality for so many people.
Exactly. And the book really puts Clara's journey into historical context. This is the time of the Dred Scott case, which basically said that Black people, even if they were free, couldn't be citizens.
So even though she eventually gained her freedom, she still faced so many obstacles. It's mind-boggling to think about the injustices people faced just because of the color of their skin.
It's truly awful. And, her journey west wasn't about, getting rich or anything. It was about survival. and finding her daughter.
Wow, she was driven by such a powerful force. It's amazing how she kept going, even when things were so difficult.
Yeah, she was incredibly resourceful. The book talks about how she took on all sorts of jobs, like cooking and doing laundry. She was constantly learning new skills to survive.
You know, it's funny, we often hear about the pioneers heading west, but we don't always hear about the diverse experiences of people like Clara.
You're right. It's important to remember that history isn't just one story. There are so many perspectives and experiences that are often overlooked.
So tell me more about Clara's journey. How did she end up becoming an entrepreneur?
So she eventually ends up in Denver,
Mm.
and she uses her savings to help people in need. She was known for her generosity and her unwavering belief in, the goodness of people.
It's amazing that even after everything she'd been through, she still wanted to help others.
It really speaks to her character. And get this, after decades of searching, she's reunited with her daughter. Can you imagine?
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. What a moment that must have been.
The book describes her as saying, "I can die happy now." It's a testament to the power of hope, even in the face of such adversity.
What a beautiful sentiment. Her story is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can triumph.
Speaking of overcoming adversity, let's move on to Virginia Randolph. She was an educator who completely revolutionized education for African American children in the Jim Crow South.
The Jim Crow South, that was a time of intense racial segregation and discrimination, right?
Exactly. And Virginia, who was born to formerly enslaved parents, was deeply committed to uplifting her community through education. But she faced a lot of pushback, even from within her own community.
Wow, that's hard to believe people were against her educating Black children.
It's sad, but true. The book describes a scene where a preacher is trying to get her removed from her teaching position. It's crazy.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always easy and that sometimes the biggest obstacles come from unexpected places. But how did she handle that situation?
Well, she was incredibly smart and resourceful. The book talks about how she used scripture to diffuse a confrontation with a mother who was known for physically disciplining teachers.
She used scripture. That's pretty clever. I guess sometimes you got to use what you got to get your point across.
Exactly. And her teaching methods were really innovative for the time. She didn't just focus on textbooks. She taught kids practical skills like building fences and planting trees.
Yeah.
She wanted to prepare them for the real world.
It's like she understood that education needed to be more than just memorizing facts. It needed to be relevant to their lives.
Totally. And her work didn't go unnoticed. She eventually became a supervising industrial teacher through funding from the Jeans Fund.
The Jeans Fund, what's that?
It was started by Anna Jeans, a Quaker philanthropist who was really dedicated to improving education for Black children in the rural South.
It's amazing how these stories connect, isn't it? Like, one person's vision can have a ripple effect and inspire others to take action.
You're so right. It's like history is a web of interconnected stories and individuals. And Virginia Randolph's model of industrial education, with its emphasis on practical skills, became widely adopted across the South, thanks in large part to the support of the Jeans Fund.
That's incredible. So one woman's vision helped to transform education for countless Black children. It's a reminder that even small actions can have a huge impact.
Absolutely. And it's inspiring to see how individuals, even those working behind the scenes, can make such a profound difference.
Okay, I'm hooked. What other stories are we going to uncover in this deep dive?
Let's see, where should we go next? Maybe we should.
Ooh, I'm excited.
I know, right? It's like opening a treasure chest of hidden history. So let's...
Okay, how about we talk about Katherine Lee Bates, the woman behind America the Beautiful. I got to admit, I knew the song, but I had no idea about her.
Right, America the Beautiful. It's such a classic, you know. But Katherine's story, oh man, it's full of surprises. Picture this. New England, 1859. She's born into this family of, poets and writers.
Wow, so she was practically destined to be a writer herself. Talk about a literary family.
Obviously. And get this, the book mentions this bell in her childhood church. Guess who made it?
A church bell in the 1800s. Some famous bell maker.
Paul Revere.
No way! The Midnight Rider. I thought he just, rode horses and stuff.
I know, right? But apparently, he was a silversmith, a dentist, even a spy. And later on, he got into bell making. That bell in Katherine's church, it was his creation.
Wow, that's a pretty cool connection to history. Imagine hearing that bell every Sunday, knowing Paul Revere made it.
I know, it's like a tangible link to the past. But Katherine's life wasn't all bells and poetry. She became a professor at Wellesley College, which is a pretty big deal back then, especially for women.
Right. Women in higher education in the late 1800s, that was pretty groundbreaking.
Totally. And it was at Wellesley that she met Catherine Coleman, another professor. They became lifelong companions.
Ah, so the book talks about their relationship too.
It does, yeah. It touches on, the complexities of love and loss back then. It's a good reminder that history is about real people's lives, not just wars and politics.
For sure. But let's get back to America the Beautiful. How did that come about?
So picture this. Catherine's on a trip to Colorado in 1893. And she's just struck by the beauty of it all, the vastness of the landscape. And that's where she writes the words that become this iconic song.
Wow, inspired by the American West.
It's amazing how travel can spark creativity,
It really is. And America the Beautiful, it's different from, say, the Star-Spangled Banner. It's more about the land itself, the ideals of, brotherhood and peace.
Yeah, it's more idealistic, right? It's about the potential of America, what it could be.
Exactly. And her words have really resonated with people for generations. But, life wasn't always easy for Catherine. The book talks about her grief after Catherine Coleman passed away. Oh, that's so sad. It's a reminder that even those who achieve great things still go through tough times.
Okay, so, ready for our next story. Let's talk about the fight for women's suffrage. And this woman, Inez Milholland, she was a force of nature.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about Inez.
Well, the book describes her as audacious, intelligent, and a trifle dangerous for household use.
Haha, I love that. Sounds like my kind of woman. What did she do?
She was a lawyer, a writer, and a captivating speaker. And she wasn't afraid to make a statement. The book mentions a time when she was arrested on her way to the opera, just to draw attention to the fact that women couldn't vote, but could go to fancy events.
That's pretty clever, using those kinds of situations to make a point about the absurdity of denying women the right to vote.
Right. And like many suffragists, she was also involved in other causes, like prison reform and fighting racial discrimination, a true champion for equality.
So who else was involved in the suffrage movement?
Well, there was this woman, Maria de Lopez from California. She was a teacher and an activist, and she did something really important. She advocated for suffrage in Spanish.
Whoa, in Spanish. That's incredible, reaching out to a whole new audience.
Exactly. Remember, this was a time when immigration was a big issue and not everyone spoke English. And just like Inez, Maria wasn't afraid to be bold. The book talks about her giving speeches in the plaza, standing on her car decorated with suffrage banners.
I can picture it now, a real trailblazer.
She was. But get this. She left her teaching job and went to Europe during World War I to serve as an ambulance mechanic. She even started learning to fly airplanes.
Wow, that's amazing. Talk about breaking boundaries.
Seriously. And she was incredibly brave. The book describes how she helped rescue soldiers from a burning building during a bombing raid.
That's incredible. It just goes to show the courage and determination of these women. So were there any other inspiring figures in the fight for women's suffrage?
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about Rebecca Mitchell. She was out west in Idaho fighting for women's rights.
Idaho, that's pretty far from the hustle and bustle of the East Coast. What was her story?
Well, she got there as a young widow with 2 kids. And back then, under Illinois law, when her husband died, she lost almost all their property, even her own clothes.
Wow, that's just unfair. It's hard to imagine losing everything like that.
I know, it's crazy. But she was resilient. She remarried, had more kids, and eventually moved to Idaho. She became a missionary and a teacher, and she just kept fighting for what she believed in.
That's amazing. She didn't let those setbacks stop her. So what kind of things did she fight for in Idaho?
Well, she was a big advocate for women's suffrage, of course, but she also fought for better working conditions for minors and even started a public library. She was all about making her community a better place.
It's inspiring to see how these women, even in different parts of the country, were all working towards the same goal, equality for women.
And back in Washington, D.C., the movement was gaining momentum. In 1913, the National Woman's Party organized a huge parade the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration.
A parade? What was the purpose of that?
Well, they wanted to make a statement, draw attention to the issue of women's suffrage and put pressure on the new president. Thousands of women marched down Pennsylvania Avenue carrying banners and demanding the right to vote.
That must have been quite a sight. So how did people react?
Not well, unfortunately. The book talks about how the marchers were harassed and attacked by onlookers. Men threw things, spit on them, even tried to climb onto the floats. It's pretty disturbing to read.
Oh, wow. I can't believe people would react that way. just for women peacefully advocating for their rights.
Yeah, it was a dark moment. And the police, instead of protecting the marchers, often just stood by and watched. The National Women's Party sent a telegram to President Wilson, calling him out for not protecting the women.
It sounds like they were trying to hold him accountable for the violence and make a point about the hypocrisy of celebrating democracy while denying women the right to vote.
Exactly. And Inez Milholland, despite her declining health, went on this massive speaking tour across the country to rally support for a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage.
Wow, she was really dedicated to the cause, even when she was sick.
She was. But sadly, she passed away in 1916. But her death actually galvanized the movement. It became a rallying cry for those fighting for women's rights.
It's sad that it took someone dying for people to really pay attention, but it's powerful how her legacy continued to inspire the movement. So while all this was happening, World War I was raging in Europe.
Right, and the U.S. eventually joined the war. And women played a huge role in the war effort, both at home and overseas.
Oh, yeah. In what ways?
Well, there were these amazing women called the Hello Girls. They served as telephone operators for the U.S. Army Signal Corps in Europe.
Telephone operators? That sounds surprisingly important.
It was. They were highly skilled, multilingual, and they had to work under incredibly stressful conditions, connecting calls quickly and accurately, knowing that lives were on the line.
Wow. Talk about a high-pressure job.
They were basically pioneers, proving that women could handle these demanding technical jobs. But get this. They were denied veteran status and benefits for decades.
Seriously, that's awful. They served their country and then they were denied the recognition they deserved.
It wasn't until 1977 that Congress finally acknowledged their contributions and gave them the recognition they deserved.
Well, at least they eventually got the recognition they deserved, even if it took way too long. So, any other stories from World War I?
Oh, yeah. Have you ever heard of Cher Ami, the heroic carrier pigeon?
A carrier pigeon, like they actually used pigeons for communication during the war.
Yep. And Cher Ami, he was a real hero. He saved the lives of almost 200 American soldiers.
A pigeon saving lives? Okay, now I gotta hear this story.
So picture this. An American battalion is trapped behind enemy lines, and they're accidentally being shelled by their own artillery. Their communication lines are down, and their only hope is Cher Ami. They attach a message to his leg, begging for the shelling to stop.
Oh, wow. So this pigeon is carrying a life or death message.
Exactly. And even though he's wounded during the flight, he manages to reach headquarters and deliver the message.
That's incredible. This little bird braved enemy fire and saved those soldiers.
I know, right? He became a legend. He even got the French Croix de Guerre for his bravery.
Wow, a pigeon war hero. That's amazing. Okay, so where are we headed next on this deep dive?
Let's talk about Anna Jeanes. She was a Quaker philanthropist who really focused on education for Black children in the South.
A philanthropist, huh? Sounds like a pretty straightforward story.
Well, you might think so, but her life is full of these crazy connections to history.
Okay, you've got my attention. Spill the tea.
So, first of all, her family tree goes all the way back to William Penn, the founder of Pennsylvania. Her ancestors were those early Quaker settlers who were all about religious tolerance and social justice.
I see. So those Quaker principles like equality and community, they really run through her family's history.
Totally. And get this, her brother, Joseph, was a big fossil collector.
Fossils? Like dinosaurs?
Well, not quite dinosaurs, but he was really into those big, mysterious bones people were digging up back then. He was a big part of early paleontology.
It's so cool how all these different areas of history are connected, you know?
I know, right? But back to Anna. She was a pretty quiet woman, never married, no kids. She dedicated her life to philanthropy. And she was especially concerned about the lack of educational opportunities for Black children in the South during the Jim Crow era.
It's amazing how she saw that need and decided to do something about it.
I know. And get this, she left over $1 million to a fund for rural Black schools. That would be over $33 million today.
Whoa, $1 million back then. That's a serious chunk of change.
It is. And here's the kicker. She said the fund had to be managed by a mixed-race board. So Black voices were actually part of the decision-making process.
That's so forward-thinking for that time, especially during the Jim Crow era.
And her vision resonated with people like Booker T. Washington, the guy who said, cast down your bucket where you are.
Oh yeah, Booker T. Washington. He was a big advocate for practical education.
So the Jeanes Fund, as it was called, used the money to hire these traveling teachers who would go to rural Black schools and help local teachers. They focused on practical skills like agriculture and health alongside the regular curriculum.
So it was a really well-rounded approach to education.
Exactly. And these genes teachers helped to get better resources for the schools and create a more equal learning environment for Black children.
It's amazing how one person's vision can have such a lasting impact.
It really is. And speaking of impact, let's talk about Julius Rosenwald, the president of Sears, Roebuck & Co.
Sears, like the department store?
The one and only. And Julius Rosenwald, he was the guy who built it into the retail giant it became. But his story goes way beyond just business success. He was also a huge philanthropist.
So how did he get into philanthropy?
Well, he met Booker T. Washington, and he was really moved by his vision for helping Black communities through education.
That's pretty cool. A Jewish businessman from the North connecting with a Black educator from the South and finding common ground in their passion for social justice.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's a great example of how people from different backgrounds can come together to make a difference.
So what did Rosenwald do to support Washington's work?
Well, he was a major donor to the Tuskegee Institute, but he didn't stop there. He actually partnered with Black communities across the South to build thousands of schools.
Wait, thousands? Seriously?
Yep. Over almost 20 years, he helped build almost 5,000 schools for Black children, especially in rural areas where there weren't many educational opportunities. And he wasn't just writing checks. He was really involved, visiting schools, meeting with people, making sure the money was being used well.
Wow, that's really hands-on philanthropy. He was truly invested in making a difference.
He was. And the schools, they were called Rosenwald schools, they provided a good education to generations of Black children. And there's this cool connection to the Jeans Fund, too.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, a lot of those Jeans teachers ended up working in Rosenwald schools.
That's amazing. It's like these two different philanthropic efforts came together to create something even bigger.
Right. History is all about connections, isn't it? And speaking of connections, let's talk about World War II and the experience of Japanese Americans. This is a pretty intense chapter in the book, focusing on Daniel Inouye and Norman Mineta.
Daniel Inouye, the senator. And Norman Mineta, wasn't he a transportation secretary or something?
You got it. But their stories start way before they were famous. They both grew up in Hawaii. The book talks about their childhoods, the challenges and opportunities they faced as, Japanese Americans in the early 1900s.
I'm guessing things got pretty tough for them when World War II started.
Yeah, you're right. Inouye's family actually came to Hawaii from Japan because they were in debt. His grandfather had to send his son, Inouye's dad, to work in the sugarcane fields to try and earn enough money to pay it off.
It's a reminder that even those who came to America looking for a better life often faced a lot of hardship.
And despite being poor, Inouye's family really valued education. There's this scene in the book where young Daniel gets a bad arm injury, and the doctor who treats him refuses to take any money. He just tells him to be a good student.
Wow, what a powerful message. I bet that really stuck with him.
It did. But then, of course, everything changes when Pearl Harbor is attacked. The book talks about the shock and fear that spread through Hawaii after the attack.
I can only imagine. And I bet things were especially difficult for Japanese Americans after that.
Yeah, you're right. They faced a ton of prejudice and discrimination, even though many of them, like Inouye, were born in America and consider themselves completely American. And sadly, that fear led to one of the darkest chapters in American history: the forced relocation and incarceration of Japanese Americans.
Right, the internment camps. It's a terrible stain on our country's history.
President Roosevelt signed this executive order, and suddenly, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forced to sell their belongings, leave their homes, and go to these camps.
It's hard to believe that something like that could happen in America, a country that's supposed to be about freedom and equality.
I know. And the book doesn't sugarcoat the experience at all. It talks about the harsh conditions, the loss of freedom, the trauma that people experienced. Norman Mineta's story is particularly powerful.
What happened to him?
Well, he and his family were sent to Santa Anita Racetrack, which was turned into a temporary detention center. Imagine that, being imprisoned in a place that's meant for horse racing.
It's just dehumanizing.
And then they were sent to Hart Mountain in Wyoming, which was a more permanent camp. They lived there for years, behind barbed wire with armed guards watching them.
It's a reminder that even in a country like America, where we value freedom and individual rights, those rights can be taken away in times of fear and prejudice.
But despite all this, both Inouye and Mineta found ways to resist, to hold on to their dignity, and to hope for a better future.
How so?
Well, Inouye really wanted to serve in the military, even though he was Japanese American. He felt like it was his duty to prove his loyalty.
That's pretty brave, considering the prejudice he was facing.
It was. And eventually, he was allowed to join a segregated unit made up entirely of Japanese-American soldiers.
What happened to that unit?
They became one of the most decorated units in American military history. They fought with incredible courage and skill in Europe.
Wow. That's amazing.
It's a testament to their resilience and determination to overcome the discrimination they faced. But Inouye was seriously injured in battle. He lost his right arm.
Oh, no. That must have been incredibly difficult for him.
It was, but he came home and decided to serve his country in a different way, through politics.
So he went on to become a senator, right?
Yep. And Mineta, after serving in the Korean War, went into politics too. He became the mayor of San Jose and later served in Congress. And they both played a key role in getting the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 passed.
What was that about?
It was a formal apology from the U.S. government for the Japanese-American incarceration, and it offered reparations to survivors.
That's so important. Recognizing the wrong that was done and trying to make amends for it. It's a powerful reminder that we need to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Okay, ready for our next story. Let's talk about the civil rights movement and some of the women who helped to spark the Montgomery bus boycott.
The Montgomery bus boycott. That's when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus.
That's the one.
Yeah.
But the story is actually a lot more complex than that.
Really? How so?
Well, there's this woman named Claudette Colvin. She was only 15 when she refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, 9 months before Rosa Parks did the same thing.
Wow, I'd never heard of her before. So she was kind of a pioneer in the movement.
She was. But her story wasn't as widely publicized as Parks, partly because she was so young and partly because of the social context of the time. It's a reminder that there are often many unsung heroes in these movements, people whose stories don't always make it into the history books.
It's important to remember that, to look beyond the big names and recognize the contributions of everyone who fought for change.
Exactly. And there was another woman, Joanne Robinson, who was a key organizer of the boycott.
What does she do?
Well, she was a professor and an activist, and she was really good at mobilizing people. She organized meetings, distributed flyers, and really rallied the Black community to support the boycott.
That's incredible. It takes a lot of courage and dedication to do that kind of work, especially in a place like Montgomery, Alabama, where segregation was so deeply entrenched.
And she faced a lot of danger. Her car was vandalized, and she received death threats.
Wow, that's scary.
But she didn't back down. She was determined to see the boycott succeed. And it did. It lasted over a year, and it was a major victory for the civil rights movement.
It showed the power of nonviolent resistance to challenge injustice and bring about real change.
And the stories of these women, Claudette Colvin, Joanne Robinson, and so many others, they remind us that social change doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of hard work, courage, and the willingness to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's dangerous.
Okay, so what other stories await us in this deep dive into history?
How about we head to South Carolina and meet Septima Clark? She was a teacher and activist who was a big part of the fight for voting rights and civil rights.
Seems interesting. Tell me more.
Well, her story starts with a pretty fascinating family connection. Ready for this? Her grandfather was Joel Poinsett, the guy who brought the poinsettia to the United States.
Wait, the Christmas flower? Seriously?
Yep. He was a botanist and a diplomat, and he found this vibrant red flower in Mexico that eventually got named after him.
Wow, what a random connection. History is full of surprises, isn't it?
It really is. But Poinsett's legacy is kind of complicated. He was also the Secretary of War under President Van Buren, and he oversaw the Indian Removal Act.
Ah, wow. So he was involved in the Trail of Tears.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a reminder that even people who do good things can also be part of terrible injustices.
It's important to remember that, to look at history with a critical eye and to recognize that people are complex.
Absolutely. And Septima Clark, growing up with that legacy, dedicated her life to fighting for equality and justice. She saw firsthand the inequalities in education, especially between Black and white schools.
So what did she do about it?
Well, she worked in Johns Island, South Carolina, and she saw how much poverty and lack of opportunity there was in the Black community there. She realized that education was key to breaking the cycle of poverty and empowering people to fight for their rights.
That's a powerful insight, and it makes sense considering she was a teacher.
Right, and she got involved in the fight for voting rights because she knew that having a voice in government was crucial for Black communities to challenge the racism that was so ingrained in society.
And of course, this was during the Jim Crow era, so registering to vote was incredibly dangerous for Black people in the South.
Exactly. There were poll taxes, literacy tests, and just outright intimidation and violence.
I remember learning about those literacy tests in school. They were designed to be impossible to pass, right?
They were ridiculous. There's this story in the book about a law professor at Duke who sent the questions from an Alabama literacy test to other law professors around the country. And over 70% of them got the answers wrong.
Seriously? That's crazy.
I know. It just shows how unfair and discriminatory those tests were.
So how did Septima Clark help people overcome these obstacles to voting?
Well, she started these schools called citizenship schools. They were held in churches and community centers, and they taught Black adults about things like literacy, civics, and how to register to vote.
That's a brilliant idea, empowering people with knowledge and skills to participate in the democratic process.
It was. And these citizenship schools spread across the South, and they had a huge impact on the civil rights movement.
It's amazing how education can be such a powerful tool for social change.
And her work was connected to this other really important place, the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee.
Highlander? I think I've heard of that. Wasn't it like a training ground for activists?
You got it. It was this place where people from all different backgrounds came together to learn about social justice, organizing, and nonviolent resistance.
Sounds pretty radical.
It was. It was controversial, too. A lot of segregationists hated it and called it a communist front. But despite the attacks, Highlander played a big role in the civil rights movement. People like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and John Lewis all trained there.
Wow, that's impressive. So what was Septima Clark's role at Highlander?
She led workshops there on voter registration and citizenship education. And her work helped to spread the citizenship school model all over the South.
It's amazing how all these stories connect, you know? It's like a web of people and ideas all working towards a common goal.
Exactly. And speaking of a common goal, the fight for educational equality really took center stage in 1954 with the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case.
Ah, Brown v. Board of Education. That's the case that said segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, right?
That's the one. And the book takes us back to the beginning of that case, to the story of Oliver Brown and his daughter, Linda.
Okay, so refresh my memory. What happened in that case?
Well, Linda was a young Black girl in Topeka, Kansas, and she was denied admission to an all-white school that was right near her house. Her dad, Oliver Brown, was understandably upset, and he decided to fight back.
That's so sad. Just imagine being told your child can't go to a school because of the color of her skin.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And the book does a great job of showing how segregation affected people's everyday lives.
So what happened next?
Well, the case was taken on by Thurgood Marshall, who was an incredible lawyer. He would later become the first Black Supreme Court justice.
Wow, so he argued the case that would eventually lead to desegregation.
He did, and he challenged the idea of separate but equal that had been around since the Plessy v. Ferguson case way back in 1896.
Right, Plessy v. Ferguson. That was the case that said segregation was okay as long as the facilities were equal, which of course they never were.
Exactly. And thankfully, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, realized that separate but equal was inherently unequal, and they ruled in favor of Brown.
It was a huge victory, but I'm guessing it wasn't the end of the story, right?
Sadly, no. There was a ton of backlash to the Brown decision, especially in the South. The book talks about the Little Rock Nine, the 9 Black students who tried to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas.
Oh, right, the Little Rock Nine. I remember seeing pictures of them being escorted to school by soldiers.
It was a really tense time. There were angry mobs, and the governor of Arkansas actually tried to stop the students from entering the school.
Wow, so even after the Supreme Court ruled against segregation, there was still so much resistance.
There was. And President Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to protect the students and make sure they could attend school.
It's amazing how much courage those students had, facing all that hostility and danger just to go to school.
It really is. And sadly, the resistance to integration went on for years. Some places even closed their public schools rather than integrate.
Seriously, that's crazy. Denying children an education just to maintain segregation? It's mind-boggling.
It is. And as we've been talking about all these stories, it's clear that change doesn't always happen easily or quickly. It often takes a lot of struggle, sacrifice, and the courage of everyday people to make things better.
Absolutely. And that's what makes these stories so important. They remind us that we all have a role to play in fighting for justice and equality.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one more story from the civil rights movement. The book revisits the story of Rosa Parks, but it focuses on something that happened before the bus boycott, something that really shaped her activism.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What happened?
Well, in 1944, a young black woman named Reese Taylor was brutally raped by 6 white men in Alabama.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
It was a horrific crime. And Rosa Parks, years before the bus boycott, was actually involved in seeking justice for Reese Taylor. She worked for the NAACP at the time, and she investigated the case and tried to get the men arrested.
Wow, I had no idea. So this case was a big part of her early activism.
It was. And sadly, despite overwhelming evidence, the men were never indicted. It's a tragic example of how the legal system often failed to protect black victims of racial violence, especially women.
It's a reminder that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about buses and voting. It was about challenging a whole system of oppression that affected every aspect of life for black people.
Exactly. So as we finish up our exploration of the small and mighty, what are some of your key takeaways?
I think the biggest one is that history is full of these incredible people who may not be household names, but who made a real difference in the world. They were teachers, activists, philanthropists, everyday folks who saw a problem and decided to do something about it.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And it's inspiring to see how their actions, however small they may have seemed at the time, had a ripple effect and helped to create a better future for all of us.
And I think it's a call to action for all of us,
Right.
to look around our own communities and see what needs to be done and to find ways to contribute to making things better.
I love that. It's like Virginia Randolph said, find your next needed thing and do it.
Exactly. We can all be small and mighty in our own way.
Absolutely. So if you're interested in learning more about these amazing people, definitely check out The Small and Mighty and keep an eye out for those unsung heroes in your own community.
You never know. You might just be inspired to make a little history yourself. Her home sparking a legal battle that would eventually reach the highest court in the land.
It's hard to imagine, the frustration and the disappointment Oliver Brown must have felt being told his daughter couldn't attend to school simply because of her race. The book really captures the everyday realities of segregation, the arbitrary and cruel nature of a system that denied black children equal opportunities.
And this case spearheaded by the brilliant lawyer Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first black Supreme Court justice, challenged the very foundation of segregation. It questioned the legality of the separate but equal doctrine, which had been upheld by the Supreme Court in the Plessy v. Ferguson case back in 1896.
It's amazing to think about the courage it took to challenge a precedent that had stood for almost 60 years. And thankfully, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, recognized the inherent inequality of segregation and issued a unanimous decision in favor of Brown.
It was a landmark victory, a legal triumph that sent shockwaves across the nation. But, as we know, the road to integration would be long and arduous, fraught with resistance and setbacks.
The book highlights the intense backlash to the Brown decision, particularly in the South, where white communities clung to segregation and resisted any attempt to integrate schools. The story of the Little Rock Nine, the 9 black students who bravely integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, is a powerful example of that resistance.
Their arrival at the school, surrounded by jeering crowds and armed National Guardsmen, was a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement. It captured the nation's attention and exposed the deep divisions and the violence that often accompanied integration.
The book details the harrowing experiences of these students, the daily harassment, the threats, and the constant fear for their safety. One of the most enduring images from that time is the photograph of Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine, attempting to enter the school alone, surrounded by a hostile mob.
It's a haunting image, a stark reminder of the courage it took for these young people to simply attend school.
And the Little Rock crisis, as it came to be known, forced President Eisenhower to intervene, sending federal troops to escort the students to school and enforce the court's desegregation order.
It was a dramatic showdown between state and federal authority, highlighting the complexities of implementing desegregation in the face of fierce resistance. And while the Little Rock Nine were eventually able to attend Central High School, the fight for integration was far from over.
Absolutely. The book describes the various tactics used by segregationists to resist the Brown decision, including school closures, the establishment of private white academies, and ongoing legal challenges. The story of Prince Edward County, Virginia, is a particularly jarring example. The county closed its entire public school system for 5 years, rather than integrate denying black children access to education while providing white students with vouchers to attend private schools.
It's a blatant example of how far some were willing to go to maintain segregation. These actions really highlight the deep-seated racism and the lengths to which people would go to resist change.
It's a sobering reminder that progress is not always linear. And as we continue exploring these stories of unsung heroes, I'm struck by how their actions often challenge our understanding of history. We tend to focus on the big names, the landmark events. But these individuals remind us that change is often driven by grassroots efforts by ordinary people who see a need and step up to meet it.
I completely agree. And speaking of challenging traditional narratives, the book revisits the story of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, but this time with a focus on a lesser-known incident that sheds light on the complexities of the movement and Rosa Parks' activism.
It's easy to simplify history, to focus on single events or individuals. But the book reminds us that these stories are often more nuanced and interconnected than we realize.
Exactly. It delves into the story of Recy Taylor, a young black woman who was brutally raped by 6 white men in Alabama in 1944. It's a horrifying story, a stark reminder of the racial terror and violence that black women faced in the Jim Crow South.
And what's striking is that Rosa Parks, years before her famous act of defiance on the bus, was involved in seeking justice for Recy Taylor. She was an investigator for the NAACP at the time, and she worked tirelessly to bring attention to Taylor's case and demand that her attackers be held accountable.
Despite overwhelming evidence, 2 all-white grand juries refused to indict the men. It's a tragic example of the systemic racism and the lack of justice for black victims of sexual violence. This case, though largely forgotten by history, had a profound impact on Rosa Parks, fueling her determination to challenge segregation and fight for racial equality.
It shows that the fight for civil rights wasn't just about buses and voting rights. It was about dismantling a system of oppression that permeated every aspect of life, from education to housing to the legal system.
And the book's exploration of Recy Taylor's story adds a crucial layer of understanding to the broader narrative of the movement. It forces us to confront the often invisible struggles of black women and to recognize the interconnectedness of racial justice, gender equality, and social change.
It's a powerful reminder that these movements are not isolated, they're intertwined. And as we wrap up our deep dive into these historical excerpts, I can't help but think about the book's title, The Small and Mighty. It's a fitting tribute to these unsung Americans who, despite facing incredible obstacles, made extraordinary contributions to history.
They weren't presidents or generals or famous inventors. They were teachers, activists, philanthropists, everyday people who saw a need for change and took action.
Their stories remind us that we all have the potential to make a difference, no matter how small our actions may seem. It's about finding our own next needed thing, as Virginia Randolph so eloquently put it, and using our unique skills and talents to contribute to a more just and equitable world.
So as you go about your day, think about the small and mighty individuals in your own community, the teachers, the activists, the volunteers, the everyday people who are working to make a difference.
What can you learn from their stories? How can you contribute to the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable world?
These are questions worth pondering, and I encourage you to explore further, perhaps by reading The Small and Mighty itself or researching the individuals who resonated most strongly with you, because their stories remind us that history is not just something we read about in textbooks. It's something we're all a part of shaping and reshaping with each passing day.
And the choices we make, the actions we take, however small they may seem, can ripple outward, creating a better future for ourselves and for generations to come.
So go out there and be the change you want to see in the world.
Embrace your own small and mighty spirit, and let's make history together.